Namaste and welcome to Daily News Simplified, the what, why and how of newspaper reading.
Now we will be analyzing the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper of 15th of September 2018, and the news that would be covered today is given on the screen, and the timestamp for the same is given in the description and the comment section given below. And now with this, let us start with the first article. Now we have taken this article from the editorial page on page 6. Now from this editorial, there are two aspects needed to be understood. First, as to why is it in the news? And it is after that we'll try to understand as to what has been the focus of this editorial. So now let us first understand as to why this editorial is in the news. Now what had happened is that the Reserve Bank of India in the February of 2018 had passed a circular which has said that banks in India have to recognize loans as non-performing assets if the repayment of these loans have been delayed by just one day. And therefore, according to the RBI circular, if the banks recognize these loans as non-performing assets, they would have to be resolved by the banks within 180 days. However, if the banks fail to resolve these non-performing assets within 180 days, then these stressed assets would have to be forced to undergo insolvency proceedings, and they would be undergoing insolvency proceedings under the new Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. But what has happened now is that the Supreme Court has put a stay order on this circular passed by the Reserve Bank of India. So now hopefully up till here you've understood as to why this editorial is in the news, wherein the Reserve Bank of India in February of 2018 passed a circular which had said that banks would need to recognize loans as non-performing assets if the repayment of these loans have been delayed by just one day. And upon recognizing these loans as non-performing assets, the banks would have to resolve them within 180 days. Moreover, according to this circular passed by the Reserve Bank of India, if banks fail to comply with this circular, these stressed assets, which have been declared as non-performing assets, would be forced to undergo insolvency proceedings under the new Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. However, what has happened now is that the Supreme Court has put a stay order on this circular by the Reserve Bank of India. Now you have to understand that this news is currently in transition, wherein we'll have to wait and see on how the Supreme Court moves forward with regards to the circular passed by the Reserve Bank of India. So in addition to this, what is required to be understood as to what is the focus of this editorial, wherein this editorial talks about the power sector within the context of this circular by the Reserve Bank of India, wherein what this editorial says is that several power companies in India are under financial stress. And because several power companies in India were under financial stress, they were under the purview of this circular passed by the Reserve Bank of India, wherein what had happened is that several power companies in India had taken loans from banks, but now because they were under financial stress, they were not able to repay these loans, and therefore several power companies in India came under the purview of the RBI circular. Wherein according to the author in this editorial, the Supreme Court stay order on this RBI circular will give time to distressed power companies in India from being pushed to insolvency proceedings. Wherein according to the author in this editorial, the Supreme Court decision to intervene will not have any positive result to either the stressed power companies or their lenders. Wherein the author has given the reason as to why the intervention by the Supreme Court will not have any positive results to either the lenders or the power companies. When according to the author, the trouble with power companies is of structural issues. When according to the author, the various structural issues such as the absence of meaningful price reforms, unreliable fuel supply, and sustainable financing of the power sector distribution companies. And because of these structural issues, the power companies are unable to make a profit. And because of this, banks are unlikely to make money out of these stressed power companies. And apart from this, because of the structural issues that power companies face, they're also unlikely to attract investors. And it is within this context that the author has made a recommendation, wherein according to the author in this editorial, policy makers and not courts need to take charge and resolve the structural issues with the power sector. So now hopefully up till here you've also understood the focus of this editorial, wherein this editorial talks about the Indian power sector within the context of this circular by the Reserve Bank of India, wherein what has happened is that several power companies in India are under financial stress, and because they are under financial stress, they are not able to repay the banks from whom they've taken loans, and therefore these stressed power companies came under the purview of this RBI circular. However, what has happened now is that the stay order of the Supreme Court will give time to these distressed power companies from being pushed to the insolvency and bankruptcy codes. However, according to the author in this editorial, the intervention by the Supreme Court will not have a positive result to either the lenders or the power companies. When according to the author, it would not have a positive result because power companies in India have structural issues. And because of these structural issues, they are unlikely to make money for themselves or enough money to repay the banks. And apart from this, because of these structural issues, the power companies are also unlikely to attract investors. And it is within that context that the author in this editorial has given a recommendation that it is not the courts that can resolve the structural issues with the power sector, and it is the policy makers, especially the executive of this country, that need to take charge and resolve the structural issues that exist with the power sector. Wherein, with regards to UPSC syllabus, the focus of the editorial, which is the power sector, would be placed within Chase Paper 3, within the section Economic Development, and within the subsection Infrastructure. And so, now with this, let us move on to the next article. Now, we have taken this article from page 12. Now, the first thing that we're going to understand from this article are the various steps that are going to be undertaken by the Mahindra & Mahindra Group to become carbon neutral. And the second aspect we're going to understand as to what is science-based targets. Now let us first understand the steps that are going to be undertaken by Mahindra & Mahindra to become carbon neutral. Now I'll try to understand these steps within the generalized context as to what steps can be undertaken by companies in India to become carbon neutral. Now the first thing that you need to understand as to what is meant by carbon neutral, wherein in simple terms it means having equal carbon removed from the atmosphere which a particular company, individual, country, or any other put into the atmosphere. Now, Mahindra & Mahindra intends to become carbon neutral by first becoming energy efficient, secondly, by the use of renewable power, and thirdly, the company Mahindra & Mahindra intends to have its residual emissions to be addressed through carbon sinks. Now, you also have to understand that carbon sinks are natural or artificial reservoirs which accumulate or store some form of carbon containing chemical compound. Wherein, for example, forests are a form of natural carbon sinks that accumulate and store CO2. Now, the fourth and the last step given in the article that the company Mahindra & Mahindra intends to use to become carbon neutral is the use of carbon price. Now, carbon price is a form of cost that is applied to carbon emissions in the form of tax, cess, or any other form, and it is to be paid by emitters or by companies or individuals that release carbon emissions. So now hopefully up till here you've understood the various steps that Mahindra & Mahindra intend to use to become carbon neutral, wherein carbon neutral in simple terms means having equal carbon removed from the atmosphere by a company or an individual that this particular company or individual has actually released into the atmosphere. So let's say if Mahindra & Mahindra has released 100 tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, then it will ensure that it removes 100 tons of carbon from the atmosphere to become carbon neutral. And the Mahindra & Mahindra Group intends to become carbon neutral by using efficient energy, secondly by the use of renewable power, and thirdly by having its residual emissions addressed through carbon sinks. When carbon sinks are natural artificial reservoirs that accumulate and store some form of carbon containing chemical compound, wherein a forest is a form of a natural carbon sink which accumulates and stores CO2 from the atmosphere. And what Mahindra & Mahindra intends to do is to form either natural or artificial carbon sinks. So let's say if the company Mahindra & Mahindra plant a lot of trees to create a natural forest, then it is through forming this forest as a carbon sink that they can address their residual emissions. And the fourth and the last step given in the article is that the company intends to use carbon price, wherein carbon price is the cost applied to carbon emissions in the form of tax, cess, or any other form, and has to be paid by the company or an individual that has released that particular carbon into the atmosphere. So let's say if the company Mahindra & Mahindra releases 100 tons of carbon into the atmosphere, then it would ensure that it pays some form of price to compensate for the release of this 100 ton of carbon into the atmosphere. So now hopefully you've understood the various steps on how a company in India can become carbon neutral. Now let us understand as to what are science-based targets. Now science-based target is an initiative to ensure that corporate companies transition towards low carbon economy, wherein this initiative intends that companies form a clear roadmap to reduce their carbon footprint so as to successfully implement the Paris Agreement goals. Now, Science Based Target is a joint initiative of the UN Global Compact, World Wildlife Fund, and apart from other international NGOs. And apart from this, an important aspect for you to remember with regards to your prelims examination is that science-based targets include Scope 3 targets, meaning that if more than 40% of a company's emissions occurs in its supply chain, then the company would reduce both its direct and supply chain emissions. Now, one of the reasons it has included Scope 3 targets because most of the major companies in the world are interlinked through supply chains. So it means that every supply chain that is connected to the Mahindra & Mahindra company and Mahindra & Mahindra would have to ensure that it reduces its direct emissions, and Mahindra & Mahindra would also have to ensure that there is a reduction in emissions from the companies that are in its supply chains. So now hopefully up till here you've understood as to what are science-based targets, wherein science-based targets is an initiative to ensure that corporate companies transition towards low carbon emission based economies, wherein under this initiative companies have to form a clear roadmap in the form of having science-based targets so as to shrink their carbon footprint and to ensure the successful implementation of the Paris Agreement goals, wherein this initiative is led by the UN Global Compact, the World Wildlife Fund, and other various international NGOs. Where an important aspect of science-based target, especially for your prelims examination, is that it includes Scope 3 targets, wherein if more than 40% of the emissions occur in a company's supply chain, then that company has to ensure that there is a reduction in its direct emissions and also ensure that there is a reduction in the emissions within its supply chain. Now, another important aspect for you to remember is that Mahindra Sanyo Steel Company is the first Indian company that has taken up the initiative of science-based targets. And Mahindra Sanyo Steel became the first Indian company in March of 2018. So now hopefully you've understood as to how a company in India can become carbon neutral. And secondly, you've also understood as to what are science-based targets. Now with regards to your UPSC Civil Services Examinations syllabus, wherein first with regards to your prelims examination, it would be placed in general issues of environmental ecology and climate change. And with regards to your mains examination, it would be placed in GS paper 3 within the section environment and within the subsection conservation and environmental impact assessment. Now question for your practice is with regards to science-based target, consider the following statements, and the correct answer to this question would be given in the end of this video. And so now with this, let us move on to the next article. Now we have taken this article from page 5. Now what this article talks about, that India has promised to end AIDS by 2030 under the UN Sustainable Development Goals, wherein ending AIDS by 2030 forms a part of the Sustainable Development Goal number 3, wherein the Sustainable Development Goal number 3 states good health and well-being and intends to end the epidemic of AIDS. Now what this article provides are various observations from the HIV Estimation 2017 survey, wherein this HIV Estimation 2017 survey has been conducted by NACO, or the National AIDS Control Organization, wherein the first main observation as highlighted by the article is that there has been a small increase in number of new HIV infections, wherein in the 2017 survey there are around 87,000 new HIV infections, while in the 2015 survey there were around 86,000 new HIV infections. Apart from this, what this article also provides is that there has been an 80% decline in estimation of new infections since the peak in 1995. And apart from this, the article also provides that there has been a 71% decline in AIDS-related death since the peak in 2005. And the last main observation given in the article is that the national incidence of HIV infections, meaning the annual new infections of HIV, has remained low in the country. Wherein according to this article, the national incidence of HIV is high in particular geographical and particular population groups in India. So now hopefully you've understood the focus of the article, wiping out AIDS by 2030, wherein India has promised to end AIDS by 2030 under the UN Sustainable Development Goals, wherein ending the epidemic of AIDS is part of the Sustainable Development Goal number 3 of good health and well-being. And what this article provides are various observations from the HIV Estimations 2017 survey, which is conducted by the National AIDS Control Organization, wherein the first main observation given in the article is that there is a small increase in new HIV infections, where in 2017 there are 87,000 new HIV infections, while in the 2015 survey there were roughly around 86,000 new HIV infections. And this is why the article says that wiping out AIDS by 2030, as per India's promise to the UN Development Goal, will not be easy due to a small increase in new HIV infections. Apart from this survey also says that there has been an 80% decline in estimations of new infections since the peak in 1995, and in similar terms, there has been a 71% decline in AIDS-related deaths since the peak in 2005. Wherein, for example, let's say that there were 100 AIDS-related deaths in 2005. However, as per the 2017 survey, there has only been 29 AIDS-related deaths. And in similar terms, if there were 100 new HIV infections in 1995, now it has reduced to 20 new HIV infections in 2017. And the last main observation given in the article is that the national incidence of HIV, meaning the annual new infection of HIV in the country, remains low. Wherein, according to the article, an increase in new infections in HIV is high in specific geographical regions and among specific population groups. Wherein, with regards to UPSC examination, this article and the explanation given in this section with related to AIDS would be placed in GS paper 2 within the section Social Justice and within the subsection Issues relating to development and management of social sector services relating to health. And apart from this, with regards to your prelims examination, you should remember that the eradication of AIDS forms a part of sustainable goal number 3, which is good health and well-being. And so now with this, let us move on to the next article. Now we have taken this article from page 5. Now what this article talks about is that the Supreme Court of India has questioned that leprosy-free tag that has been given to India, wherein the Supreme Court has raised various concerns with regards to leprosy in India. Now what had happened was that India was declared leprosy-free on 31st of December 2005. However, the Supreme Court of India, based on the National Leprosy Eradication Program report, has raised various concerns. Wherein the first concern raised by the Supreme Court is that based on the National Leprosy Eradication Program report, only 543 districts of India out of the total 642 can be considered leprosy free. The second concern raised by the Supreme Court is that there has been an underestimation of total number of leprosy patients in India. The third concern raised by the Supreme Court is that the elimination of leprosy in India is now not a dedicated service objective, wherein the elimination of leprosy in India has been integrated to the general health services. When if you take an example, the elimination of AIDS in India has a dedicated service objective of the National AIDS Control Organization. But because India was declared leprosy free, the elimination of leprosy in India is now integrated to general health services. Now the fourth and the last concern raised by the Supreme Court, as highlighted in the article, is that leprosy patients and families are now not extended benefits under government social sector schemes. So now hopefully you've understood the focus of this article, wherein what had happened was that India was declared leprosy free on 31st of December 2005. However, in a recent judgment of the Supreme Court based on the National Leprosy Eradication Program report, the Supreme Court has raised various concerns, wherein the first concern raised by the Supreme Court is that only 543 districts of the total 642 districts in India can be considered leprosy free based on the WHO standards. The second concern raised by the Supreme Court is that the Government of India is underestimating the number of leprosy cases. The third concern raised by the Supreme Court is that elimination of leprosy is now not a dedicated service objective and has been integrated to general health services. And what it has done is that it has led to diversion of funds which would have been dedicated to eliminating leprosy. And the fourth and the last concern raised by the Supreme Court is that leprosy patients and families are not extended benefits under various social sector schemes. Wherein what used to happen earlier is that any new government social sector scheme had provision to include leprosy patient and families within their purview. However, because India was declared leprosy free in 2005, leprosy patients and families are now not being extended benefits under the new social sector schemes. Wherein this article and the explanation given in this section would be placed in GS paper 2 within the section Social Justice and within the subsection Issues relating to development and management of social sector services relating to health. So now hopefully you understood the various concerns raised by the Supreme Court as highlighted in this article with regards to elimination of leprosy in India. And so now with this, let us move on to the next article. Now we have taken this article from page 11. Now what we'll understand from this article is what is Wholesale Price Index or WPI, and we'll try to understand this from the perspective of your prelims examination. Now the Wholesale Price Index measures the average change in the prices of commodities for bulk sale, and the Wholesale Price Index is measured at the level of early stages of transactions. Now you have to understand that this means that inflation is measured only at the wholesale level, and it does not measure inflation at the retail level. When you must have understood from an earlier explanation that inflation at retail level is measured by the Consumer Price Index or CPI. Now, the second aspect of wholesale price index that you need to understand is of the WPI index basket, wherein the wholesale price index covers commodities falling under three major groups, first being primary articles, second being fuel and power, and the third being manufactured product. Wherein, in addition to this, you should remember that manufactured products have the highest weightage and the number of items while calculating wholesale price index inflation. When you have to understand that the prices for the major groups are tracked at the wholesale or the factory gate level, wherein let's say a particular manufactured good when leaving a factory gate cost about rupees 100. However, this product is sold in market at 120. However, under wholesale price index inflation, the price that would be undertaken is the price of the product when it leaves the factory gate. The fourth aspect that you need to remember with regards to wholesale price index is that WPI does not cover services. And apart from this, what else you need to remember with regards to wholesale price index is that the base year for measuring WPI is 2011 and 12. Now, the last aspect that you need to remember with regards to wholesale price index is that it is a monthly data which is released by the Office of Economic Advisor under the Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. Now, previously, various questions have been asked in your prelims examination related to inflation, wherein the most recent question, which was asked on inflation, was asked in the prelims of 2015, which had asked which of the following brings out the consumer price index number for industrial workers, where the correct answer to this question is C, the Labor Bureau. Wherein a question for practice is consider the following statements with regards to wholesale price index, wherein the first statement itself was asked in the prelims examination of 2010. And the correct answer to this question would be provided in the end section of this video. And so now with this, let us move on to the next article. Now we have taken this article from page 18. Now this is a complicated article which is related to environment and climate change. But what you should understand with regards to UPSC examination syllabus, when trying to learn and understand various issues with regards to environment and climate change, the UPSC syllabus does not require any form of specialization, and therefore it is not required to go into in-depth analysis of issues related to environment and climate change. And it is within that context that we'll try to understand this article without going into the technical aspects. Now, what this article talks about is that a recent study has found that increased emissions of aerosol due to pollution, and this increased emission of aerosol due to pollution has led to a cooling effect of 1 degree Celsius during Indian summers. Now, an aerosol is a suspension of fine solid particles or liquid droplets in a gas. Now, examples of aerosol are smoke, ocean haze, air pollution, and smog, wherein this report further gives various impacts of the increased emissions of aerosol. Wherein the first impact is that there is an increased cooling seen during the day. Now, apart from this, what happens at night is that there is an increase in temperature during night time. And what both of these effects have done is the shrinking of the diurnal temperature difference. Now, the diurnal temperature difference is basically the difference in temperature of day and night. But this diurnal temperature difference drives the convection process, meaning where water evaporates and reaches the atmosphere as water vapor, and thereby leading to the development of clouds. But if the diurnal temperature difference actually decreases, whereas this is what has happened due to the increased emissions of aerosol, and if this diurnal temperature difference continues to decrease, the lower layer of the atmosphere will reduce in height, which causes more aerosols to get into the atmosphere. And therefore it eventually affects the distribution of moisture and rainfall, thereby leading to extreme weather conditions. So now hopefully up till here you've understood the impact of the increased emissions of aerosols in the Indian atmosphere, wherein this increased emissions of aerosol has led to a cooling effect, wherein there has been an increased cooling seen during day, while there has been an increase in temperature during night time. And what this has done is shrunk the difference in the diurnal temperature difference, meaning the difference in temperature of day and night. Now this diurnal temperature difference is important because it drives the convection process, meaning where water evaporates and reaches the atmosphere as water vapor, thereby leading the development of clouds. And if this diurnal temperature difference continues to decrease or shrink, it leads to the lower layer in atmosphere to reduce in height, and thereby this reduction in height also causes more aerosols to enter the atmosphere. And this continued concentration of aerosols in the atmosphere affects the distribution of moisture and rainfall, and thereby cause extreme weather conditions such as heavy rainfall or droughts.
And now with this, we come to an end in the analysis of today's newspaper. Now we move on to the question for today.